Welcome back to the Bob Davis Podcasts. This is going to be podcast 590, live from the studio Friday morning, getting ready to post the Bob Davis Podcast radio show for this week, and a very special Bob Davis Podcast radio show, because I interviewed Hennepin County Commissioner Jeff Johnson on the Met Council issue. And as you'll hear in the open, just very quickly as the dryer rolls in the background, beginning to be an issue in cities all over America, these unelected planning councils that have the power of suzerains. They're able to tell towns and cities what they will and will not do when it comes to how dense their populations are, what their development issues look like, and often by state statute. The Met Council is the largest and most expensive of these councils across the country, which makes us number one in at least something in Minnesota. We're overachieving. So in this podcast, we're going to do the radio show with Hennepin County Commissioner Jeff Johnson, and I hope you enjoy it. He provides a little bit of insight from a political perspective and from the county commissioner perspective on the Met Council and what to do about it. So here's segment one. Let's roll it. Welcome to the Bob Davis Podcasts radio show. For all the podcasts, visit thebobdavispodcasts.com. Metropolitan planning councils are becoming an important political issue across the country, in urban areas, but also in medium-sized cities in Oregon and Kentucky and Tennessee, and even here in Minneapolis and St. Paul, where the granddaddy of these unelected planning bodies exists. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, in my home, it is called the Metropolitan Council. We're going to talk with Hennepin County Commissioner Jeff Johnson about Minneapolis and St. Paul's Metropolitan Council in this show. So, Jeff Johnson, Hennepin County Commissioner, you just put out a video about Minnesota's and Minneapolis and St. Paul's Metropolitan Council. And this is only one of a number of videos that you've posted, at least on Facebook, that I know about. So just real quick, let's start with you telling me about the videos, why you're doing them, what you've been doing, so people can get an idea if they see them on Facebook, what kind of stuff you've been doing.
Yeah, and there's actually just two of them. I did one a few months ago on the Southwest Light Rail project, and then this one is on the Met Council. And I didn't actually intend to do more than one of them. I did the Southwest Light Rail project because that was a big issue with the legislature as to whether that should be funded or not. And I was hearing from a lot of Republicans during that election season. They were saying, I don't understand why Republican legislators are so opposed to this. I can't explain it to people because trains sound like such a great idea. And when I would give them, a 2 to 3 minute explanation, they would say, "Oh, wow, I guess I'd never heard it. I'd never heard those things explained to me. That would be helpful if more of us Republicans had an answer to this question." So I thought, well, we'll make a little video. So that was like a 3-minute video with that explanation. And I put that out, and I got huge response, very positive response from people. And so a couple months ago, we thought it kept coming up that the Met Council, people didn't understand the Met Council at all.
No,
and obviously, once you do understand the Met Council, you probably have some strong feelings one way or the other about it. And so we just decided to do this one to better explain to people why some of us are so opposed to the Met Council and what they're doing.
Well, and we'll get into in this show a little bit about the Met Council, but I agree with you. I think there's a lot of people that really are not really clear about what this council does. So let's talk a little bit about the Met Council. In the video on the Met Council, you gave a pretty exhaustive history of the panel, and I think it's a good place to start in this first segment for the show. Because many people may have heard, you hear about the Met Council in the news, but they may not know the full history.
Right.
So you did it in the video. You won't be able to do it as succinctly on the radio because we can't show the video. But let's talk about the history of the Met Council a little bit.
Sure, and actually, to me, the history actually is probably fairly common sense. I think it was 1967 it was created. And the legislature, the Minnesota legislature, created it as a regional authority to kind of help control the growth of the sewer system and an integrated bus system, an integrated, not really a transit system because it was just buses back then.
Yeah.
For the what was then I think the 5-county metro area is now the 7-county metro area, and it was 16 appointed members by the governor, and then an appointed chair of the council by the governor. And there were regional authorities like that all over the country at the time, as there still are. But unfortunately, their power has grown dramatically since then.
Well, yeah, and that would be my next question: is they were supposed to just handle sewer, water, and maybe some transit. And do they also supervise the airport? Is that or
no,
is that's a separate thing?
There's the Minneapolis Airports Commission, the MAC. That's a separate appointed body that takes care of the airport.
Which my understanding is the MAC has always been viewed as a pretty good agency.
Yeah, and maybe the difference is the MAC has a very, very specific role given to it by the legislature that says you manage the airport, and that's it. And the problem with the Met Council is they were given a relatively specific set of duties, but they themselves kept trying to expand it, and over the years, legislatures and governors have gone along with that. And so, and now the Met Council is at a point where they're just expanding it themselves, and nobody seems to be trying to stop them.
Well, what's this thing about 85? They're $85 million in debt because the funding for Southwest Rail didn't come through, and they just went ahead and did it anyway, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, that whole thing was just a big farce. That was okay. So Southwest Light Rail. The way light rail systems are paid for in America right now, usually, I think every instance, 50% is covered by the federal government because, that money falls out of trees and we can't possibly not train if 50% is funded by the federal government.
Right.
So 50% by the feds, 10% by the state, 10% by some local authority, usually a city or a county, and then I believe 30% by a regional authority like the Met Council. I might be a little off on those percentages. And so what happened with Southwest Light Rail is we don't have the 50% from the feds yet, but people seem confident that's coming. I'm a little less confident. Hennepin locals gave their 10%. The Met Council ponied up its 30%. I say their 10% and its 30%. It's all taxpayer money.
Right. It comes out of everyone's wallet.
That's right. And the state did not fund that 10%. The Republican House blocked it, essentially, in the last session. And we were told by the governor and the Met Council that if we block, if the state doesn't pay its 10%, we cannot move forward with this project. It's not possible under state law to move forward with this project. It has to be funded 10% by the state.
Right.
Well, once session ended, it took, a few weeks at the most for everyone to figure out that there was always a backup plan, and that was Hennepin County and the Met Council to just fill that hole with property tax dollars. And so, unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. And so, because of that, the Met Council spent a lot more, tens of millions more than what was in their budget, and now they got to figure out how to fill that hole.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, we all know you ran for governor as a Republican. You're a Republican, but this is really a bipartisan issue. I have a lot of Democrat friends in Uptown and, Kenwood, and they are up in arms about Southwest Light Rail and hence the Met Council. They're furious at the Met Council. So for the first time, this is one of those issues that both Democrats and Republicans might actually be able to agree on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is not it's not as partisan an issue as a lot of others in the legislature. And when you look at the county officials and the local officials, city councilors and mayors in the metro area that have spoken out against the Met Council in the past year or year and a half since they put out their big 2040 Thrive plan, their comprehensive long-term plan, it has been a broad mix of liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, because what they see is a huge power grab by this unelected body away from elected officials on city councils and county boards. And that's not partisan at all.
So they're trying to influence local towns and cities by pushing their point of view to that. That's new information, actually. I didn't know that.
And the way they do that is they hold the purse strings of an awful lot of transportation funds and affordable housing funds. And so they can either overtly or maybe not so overtly tie those funds to whether you're doing things in a from a policy standpoint that they support, like more dense growth and transit-oriented development and other things like that.
Well, and this is a good place for us to stop for this segment, because I think we need to talk about how big this thing is and what it does, and its relationship with both Hennepin County, people like you, and the different districts of Hennepin County, as well as the towns and cities in the whole metropolitan area, that they're in a position of really dictating to these towns and cities what they can and cannot do. So we'll talk about that shortly. This is the Bob Davis Podcasts radio show. We're back amid the cacophony of the house during the morning hours. The dryer, the heat is running, it's cold outside. And it's January, but this time of the year, this is the time of the year that companies start trying to figure out, A, they're either budgeting, or B, they're starting to figure out where they're going to do their team building exercises. I just read a story about a team building exercise. This is no lie, where they simulate a plane crash, and they drop them into a pool in this plane-like thing, and people actually faint. And they were singing the praises of this team building exercise where it's a simulated plane crash, and I just had to laugh, because why does it have to be so hard? I always talk about Brush Studio in the West End, and I talk about it as a team building exercise for companies. They just had Medtronic over there, and I usually would talk about rappelling down a cliff or walking across hot coals, and now I guess I have to add to it simulating a plane crash, which I think would be great for somebody who thinks that's kind of cool, but I don't see why a team building exercise has to be, honestly, a life or death experience. How about doing something that's really fun? How about doing it in a relaxed social setting? And how about doing something where you come away with a creative output that really is something that you want to hold up and show people? Because in today's diverse workforce, you can't drag everybody out to a simulated plane crash or do the stuff that Grandma and Grandpa did when they were running the business, where they, had a big meeting down at the Minneapolis Athletic Club or something. Today, you have to get your team together and do something that allows them to bond and to experience each other and work with each other. And here's the thing about team building exercises at Brush Studio in the West End and St. Louis Park. This is a great experience, because what happens is an artist guides your people through a painting, making a painting, painting a painting step by step. This is not paint by numbers. People are amazed at what they come away with, but they're event planning ninjas, which means you can have it the way you want it. They have a huge wine and beer selection. They have catering from Crave in the West End. They're real good at making sure that you are able to get around, talk to your people, work with your people, and experience this. And it's all designed so that the right brain can emerge from a bunch of left brain people. It's not like putting them in a plane crash, a simulated plane crash. It's not walking across coals. It's not some boring hotel meeting or some dinner. It's a really fun, relaxed, and social experience. So here's what you do. Contact Brush Studio in the West End in St. Louis Park. Plenty of parking, and especially heated parking this time of year in Minnesota. 952-236-1700, 952-236-1700. You can click on the banner at the top of the Bob Davis Podcast page. Check them out on Facebook and Instagram, brushstudio.net. Okay, here is segment 2 of this week's Bob Davis Podcast radio show. to the Bob Davis Podcasts radio show. For more of the Bob Davis Podcasts, visit thebobdavispodcasts.com. So we're talking with Hennepin County Commissioner for District 7, right? Jeff Johnson, former gubernatorial candidate in Minnesota. We were talking about the Met Council. And we've given kind of a little history of the Met Council, and I don't think people understand how big this thing actually is. And I want you to talk a little bit about the power of the Met Council over towns and cities and even Hennepin County.
Okay, well, I'll start with the basics of its bigness. As I mentioned, it has 17 members, but its operating budget is over $1 billion. It has a capital budget of over $8 billion. And then the thing that shocks everybody, it has, I believe, over 4,200 employees. I think a lot of people think of the Met Council as, this is a council with a staff of 10 or 15 or 20 or 50 or maybe 100, but it has over 4,000 employees. It actually makes it one of the larger employers in the state of Minnesota, probably the top, 30 or 40.
Sure. And you said also it's the largest agency of its kind in the United States, which is shocking.
And not only the largest, but the largest by far. I'd have to look back at the chart, but I believe second place when it comes to operating budget, was Portland. Mm. And, Portland kind of has that same philosophy, that same nanny state, government knows best philosophy as Minneapolis does. And their budget is less than half of the Met Council's budget. And then when you look at numbers 4 through 20, so you're looking at the top 20, if you add up the budgets, the operating budgets of numbers 4 through 20, that totals less than the budget of the Met Council. So their budget is not just large, it's preposterous compared to anything else in the United States of America.
And it isn't just the commissioners, and I want to talk about what these guys get paid, but it's not just the commissioners, it's also the people that are working for them. So these are really good government jobs, no?
Yeah. Yes, they're very well-paid jobs, and there's a ton of employees. And keep in mind, when we talk about this organization being big and kind of an outlier in the United States, it's an outlier not just because of its size, but because of its level of power and the fact that none of its members are elected.
Right.
They're all appointed members, and they have the power to levy property taxes on people and the power to take property through eminent domain, which are, those are two pretty important government powers. And a lot of us have a very fundamental problem with unelected people having those powers, because the taxpayers who are paying those taxes or the property owner whose property is being taken have no recourse if it's not at the ballot box, because they're a governor.
And my understanding is that some sort of compromise agreement with the speaker in the legislature we're staggering the terms now, and somehow that's going to fix things or something to that effect.
There are actually a lot of proposals out there. Some of them are small, some of them are big. One of them has a bunch of different structural changes, which includes staggered terms and many other things. And I think every proposal out there is an improvement. I happen to believe, though, that it's going to be hard to solve the problem unless we kind of start over. I think that there is an argument to be made for a regional authority, but it's hard for me to see tinkering with the Met Council and solving the problem. I think it should be eliminated. We figure out what the regional authority should look like and start over with an entirely new section in the statute books and says these are the only things they're allowed to do. And if they have taxing power, they have to be elected officials. Otherwise, run their budget through the legislature so that there's some accountability to that money.
Isn't that wouldn't we be electing essentially a shadow government where you get a Dade County versus City of Miami situation where the county authority is greater than the city authority, and we're creating a regional government. I mean, and it's almost it almost puts the legislature in abeyance in the metropolitan area of Minneapolis and St. Paul. That's what worries me about electing them.
Well, I don't think we should elect them directly. I think that it should be a committee that is populated with elected officials. So, city council members, county commissioners, people
Oh.
that back to their own taxpayers and answer to how much they're getting taxed.
My understanding is that cities and towns and the county cannot say no to the Met Council by statute. Is that true?
I don't think that's true. No. In fact, the Met Council doesn't really have any enforcement power at all. So if they said, what they do is they set goals, but they have the power of the purse, and so you could say no to them, but then they could decide that your road projects really weren't quite as important as maybe they thought they were before, and they're not going to be sharing the federal money that is run through the Met Council, which is tons of money. So that's the actual power they have. But there's I don't think there's anything in statute that gives them another way to enforce their desires, I guess. And I've asked that of when the Met Council's been before the county board to talk about goals of densification or more affordable housing or whatever it is. My question is, what if a city doesn't agree with you? What if they don't think that more dense population is better for them, and they say they're not going to do it? What can you do? And their answer is usually to give me a little smirk and say, well, we don't do anything about that, but we do have to look at, the whole picture of everything we fund and just see if they really are deserving. And
Well,
so,
I'll tell you a little story about a small town mayor who said no to them, and they said, you can't say no to us. I'm not kidding. I won't say who. I mean, there's a podcast about it, but they basically said, you can't legally say no to us.
well, they're wrong. Well, and maybe I don't know what he or she was saying no to, but
It was this. It was the idea of forcing a denser plan onto them versus what this particular town wanted. They have larger lot sizes.
yeah, no,
And-
I know who you're talking about,
Yeah.
and that's wrong. I mean, maybe they were relying upon something in state statute separate from what created them.
Okay.
That required something, and they were claiming to be following that. But they have no enforcement authority of their goals, but they've got a lot of money that they can withhold when you don't do what they want.
So a city like Minneapolis, then, it really needs the money. So they may argue about it and grumble, but they're gonna go ahead and go with it.
They are, and frankly, the city of Minneapolis and the Met Council are of the same mind about everything anyway. I mean, they think the same. I think the cities that it's tougher for are those kind of out in the outer ring edges of the metro area and the exurbs, and then that becomes much more difficult.
Right, and we'll talk about that. This is the Bob Davis Podcasts radio show.
Hey now, letters burning by my bed for you. Hey now, I can feel my instincts here for you. Hey now, by my bed for you. Hey now.
Back in the studio just ahead of segment 3 of this week's Bob Davis Podcast radio show. Guess what this is? Guess what this is? I just checked my mail. I just walked upstairs at the broadcast bunker to check the mail. And I got my new shipment of Hydrus, Hydrus, because I am a part proudly of the Hydrus Performance Revolution. What is it? Well, if you are doing any kind of fitness stuff, CrossFit, lifting, cycling, yoga, that super cycle, whatever it's called, Orange Theory, the Soul Cycle thing, which is so demanding, then you're going to find out when you do it that being hydrated is really, really important. A lot of people get super sore. They are overcome. They have to hit the mat because they can't stay up and keep doing their yoga practice when they're in a hot room of over 100 degrees, for example, with high humidity. And it's always interesting to me to experience doing yoga without Hydrus, and I ran out, and it's a big difference. Hydrus really does make a huge difference. It enables you to get down to what wrestlers call the grind. We've got tennis players, wrestlers, all kinds of athletes using it, but also people who are diabetic, people who are just walking, people who just want to be hydrated because there's no sugar in Hydrus. It is a new high-performance beverage. It gets critical electrolytes into your muscles really fast, and it uses new technology to do that, and that is why they do not have to use sugar. It's natural. It's basically the same material that is what is used by your body to build your cells, and there's just a little stevia in it, and it tastes good, orange and lemon lime, and Hydrus will help you take it to the edge, and that is what it's all about, no matter what you're doing. Join the Performance Hydration Revolution. If you want to know more about how to stay hydrated and do it in a healthy manner, visit hydrusperformance.com. That's HYDRUS, hydrusperformance.com, hydrusperformance.com. Check them out on Instagram at Hydrus Performance. They also have a Facebook page, hydrusperformance.com. You can order online all kinds of choices, and there's all kinds of information and content about what Hydrus is, how it works, and how to use it. hydrusperformance.com. I can't wait to open this up and get my Hydrus and get ready for yoga. All right, here's segment 3 of this week's Bob Davis Podcast Radio Show. Let's go. You're listening to the Bob Davis Podcasts Radio Show. For more of the podcasts, go to thebobdavispodcasts.com. Welcome back, and just to reintroduce my conversation with Hennepin County Commissioner Jeff Johnson for District 7 in Hennepin County. If you're listening in Minneapolis and St. Paul, you know about the Met Council. If you're listening in some other city, this is becoming a national issue. Unelected boards, which are really controlling development in metropolitan areas, gaining more power even in some cases than state legislatures. They're unelected, and the question is whether or not this is something that we really want to have these unelected bodies of commissioners, in this case the Met Council, who are deciding whether we're going to have sidewalks, whether we're going to have what kind of roads we're going to have, whether we're going to have trains, and doing things really almost running amok. And that's what we're talking to Hennepin County Commissioner Jeff Johnson about. We're back with Hennepin County Commissioner Jeff Johnson. We were talking about being able to say no to the Met Council, and you're saying the way this whole works is that they have these plans, these various plans that are very extensive. I mean, when you have 4,200 employees, I guess you can create some pretty extensive plans. And cities and towns, and we're talking about. And I have to say, District 7, Hennepin County, you've got some less dense towns and cities in the county that have to sign on to these plans. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, what every city in the state actually has to do, and every county, is come up with a comprehensive plan of its own. I think every 10 years. It might be every 20 years, but I think you have to do a 40-year comprehensive plan every 10 years. And by statute, it has to essentially follow the guidelines provided by the Met Council, and then you have to submit it to the Met Council. So that is a legal requirement. Now, whether you have to do exactly what the Met Council says, I don't know what they do to you other than withhold money for things.
Have you read 1984? Just kidding. Yes. Go ahead.
No, but they do that. I know they do that. They in fact, they've said in their Thrive 2040 plan, their most recent comprehensive plan, in so many words, that if cities don't have a high enough poverty level, they are going to withhold certain transportation funds in order. with the purpose of spreading out poverty around the metro area, which I don't think is necessarily has a purpose to help poor people. But
right, and besides that, isn't that something governors and legislatures are supposed to decide, and counties? I mean, Hennepin County does a lot of mitigation of poverty things.
Right. Well, and you would think mayors and city council members that their own residents elect as well. So yeah, right. Absolutely. So they. My guess is the story that you were referring to, they were saying you have to submit a comprehensive plan that follows our set of guidelines, and that city said, we're not going to do that. And I think that is probably correct. They are under statute required to submit something that is approved by the Met Council.
Again, that's unelected. And then very quickly, what about towns and cities that circle the Minneapolis Metro? And if you're listening to this show in some other state, this is not, this kind of thing is being copied by other towns and cities all over the country. You mentioned Portland, which I don't know if Portland preceded the Met Council or whether they got the idea from us or vice versa, because apparently Minneapolis and St. Paul have a Portland issue, but we're competing with Portland. We have a lot of people with beards and hipsters drinking whiskey out of mason jars, just like in Portland. But anyway, what about Rochester and Albert Lea? Because I've heard, and maybe I'm wrong, but I've heard that now they're starting to talk about enlarging the regional authority so that it includes planning in Rochester and Albert Lea and other places, maybe even further west or northwest like Walker, Minnesota.
Well, there has been talk. There's always talk about making the Met Council bigger to expand its area of influence, and of course, there's an interest amongst the Met Council members to do that because it gives them more power. I don't know how realistic that is. I mean, one of the purposes of the Met Council is there has to be a regional in every part of the state. There has to be a regional conduit for federal transportation money, and the Met Council is that for us, and that's part of the problem. So there's got to be another one down in the Rochester area. I don't know if it's just the city or if it's something bigger than that. So those things exist. The Met Council clearly wants to get bigger geographically, but the legislature would have to do that, and I hope they never do.
I don't know. I'm almost willing to say that that's hope against hope, because when you're by constitutional authority, passing on your power to decide whether or not you get a raise to a council that's unelected, it seems like a pretty good deal for legislators, because then they don't have to be responsible for what the Met Council does.
Yeah, well, it might seem politically like a good idea to a politician, but it's terrible way to run a state.
Okay, so you mentioned in the video that they seem committed to sharrows and bike trails, and they're not interested in expanding the capacity of roads in a market that is growing rapidly, and not in the urban centers, but in areas like District 7 of Hennepin County. Talk about that a little bit. We got about 3 minutes or so.
Okay, well, yeah, and they were pretty explicit, I believe, in the MSP Thrive 2040 plan, or I might have read it in a different Met Council document, but they are right up front and saying we should not be expending money going forward to relieve congestion, to relieve road congestion. That is not a realistic way. We can't grow out of it. We hear that all the time. You can't grow out of congestion. And so we are going to put all of the focus on creating different forms of transportation. So that means more bike trails, that means wider sidewalks, and obviously that means trains and a bigger bus system. And while I think all of those things, other than trains, because they're so inefficient, have a purpose, especially in the Twin Cities, roads are what everybody relies upon. Even if you don't ever drive, you rely upon the roads for an ambulance to get to your house and food to get to your grocery store. And if we aren't willing to take some of the taxpayer money that people are paying in to continue to try to relieve congestion, we've got it backwards. But that's what they're doing.
So they've committed to a certain vision of the future for a town like Minneapolis and St. Paul and for the quote-unquote urban centers. Even places like St. Louis Park or Plymouth that don't have sidewalks, parts of the areas, or Golden Valley, that may not have a sidewalk. They want to create this walkable sidewalk thing. And what happens is people then get assessed, to pay for the new sidewalk.
No, that's right.
So is that attributable generally to the Met Council's influence to these plans?
Some of that is, although some of that is, I mean, I sit on the Hennepin County Board, and the majority of the members of the county board believe that too, and that has nothing to do with the Met Council. That's just their view of the world and government. We just passed on a vote of 5-2 a few months ago a reconstruction of Washington Avenue, which is a main thoroughfare across the north end of downtown Minneapolis, because congestion was so bad during rush hour to get onto 35W.
Right.
And traffic congestion. And the project was not to expand the roads, but to eliminate 2 lanes of traffic and widen the sidewalks and add dedicated bike trails on each side.
Which is a nightmare.
It's just insane. But it passed on a vote of 5-2. And the thought is that people will then decide to bike to work instead, because it's that much harder to drive. So it's not just the Met Council, unfortunately.
I hate to laugh, but it's just, I have actually biked in below zero weather, and it's not really very conducive. It doesn't lead it's not a good way to get to work in the middle of winter.
No, it's not. And it's probably not going to get thousands of cars off the road because you've added a bike path.
Yeah. And coming up, I think what we'll do is sum all of that up. You're listening to the Bob Davis Podcast Radio Show. For more of the podcasts, visit thebobdavispodcasts.com. This is the Bob Davis Podcasts Radio Show. Running through the backwoods bare. Love that song. Just can't get enough of it. Well, just ahead of segment 4 of this week's Bob Davis Podcast Radio Show, pilots. You heard me talking about the simulated plane crash earlier. If you're a pilot and you want to be safe on takeoffs and landings, Alpha makes the revolutionary angle of attack indicator. This is a visual indicator of your angle of attack, which is really the amount of lift that your wings are producing. It's really important in general aviation for that final turn to land. If you want more info about how to fly safe, click on the Alpha Systems banners for more info about Alpha's revolutionary angle of attack indicator at thebobdavispodcast.com. And thanks, Alpha, for sponsoring the Bob Davis Podcast page and the digital page. Boy, I don't know why I'm so fired up today. I usually am half asleep when I do these, because I think it's because I went out. I was going to go have lunch with somebody and I forgot and I ran out, and so now I've come back and I'm starting to relax a little bit. Just want to mention before we get to the end, because sometimes we podcasters and YouTube people put this stuff at the end, and I don't think people even hear it. Thank you for subscribing to the Bob Davis Podcast page on the page or on iTunes. Thanks for listening on Stitcher.com. Tune in. Thanks for listening to the stream at the BobDavisPodcasts.com. And I also appreciate the likes and the shares, especially this week, and favoriting and following on Facebook and Twitter, as well as the donations for Mobile Podcast Command. That is the 2000 Ford Super Duty diesel ambulance, which will be heading out again soon. Keep listening for details. You can make that donation by clicking on that banner at the top of the Bob Davis Podcast page where it shows Mobile Podcast Command, or the little thing on the side. There's a big donate button, and you can do that there, and I really appreciate it. So let's just get to segment 4 of this week's Bob Davis Podcast Radio Show. Here we go. Listening to the Bob Davis Podcasts Radio Show. If you want to hear all the Bob Davis podcasts, visit thebobdavispodcasts.com. We're back with Hennepin County Commissioner Jeff Johnson. So very quickly, I want to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit. And isn't it better to have this kind of a plan? Isn't it better to have bike trails? Isn't it better to have trains? Isn't this vision of an urban center that's vibrant and that we can take the train and we can ride our bikes to work, isn't that something that we should be working toward? Isn't it better for the environment? Isn't it better on all levels? High rises with apartments and all that stuff?
That is definitely a life that some people want to have, and a life that some people don't want to have. And if a city decides that what is best for that city through its elected officials is to have fewer roads and fewer houses and more bike trails and higher buildings, that's fantastic, because those are the people that the residents and taxpayers of that city have elected to make those decisions for them. But to have an unelected body try to force that vision on an entire metro area, much of the metro area which just vehemently disagrees with that, and I think for good reason, that's just very, very wrong.
Well, what's the view of a county council, Hennepin County, which, by the way, is not all Republicans? I think you're probably the only one, right?
Yep.
What's your experience with the way the county views working with the Met Council on any of this stuff? Are they wholeheartedly behind it, or is there some friction between? Because again, my experience has been depending. I hate to say it's NIMBYism because I don't think it necessarily is, but at least with the train, boy, the people in Kenwood are up in arms about the train.
Yeah. No, it's. I would say the majority of the board agrees with most of what the Met Council wants to do. There's kind of a similarity in vision and a similar philosophy about what the proper role of government is and how government tends to know better than individuals. But there can be friction because we are completely separate bodies. We're an elected body and they're an appointed body. And there are some times where there's pushback. Most often it's when we want some money from them or they want some money from us. It's usually about a dollar amount more than anything else. I would say, however, that the Hennepin County Board in general cooperates most of the time with the Met Council.
So let's talk about how to address this problem. What about just cutting the funding for the legislature? I guess the parenthetical comment here is that obviously the legislators don't all come from Hennepin County. So you have a body that has an enormous amount of influence in places where we have legislators that have perhaps from rural communities or ex-urban communities that don't have the same view of this as an urbanized Hennepin County. How would these legislators gain the upper hand in the legislature to be able to either do away with the Met Council and create something new, as you said, which is more circumscribed, or actually cut the funding, take their police department away from them, cut the funding for the commissioners? I figure if you paid the commissioners, who are making somewhere around $100,000 a year, if not more, if you cut them to about $35,000 a year, maybe people wouldn't want that job.
Yeah, maybe not. Although some people are in this for power rather than money, I can tell you that as a fact.
No,
I think I think that there might be votes in the legislature right now. In fact, I'm pretty sure there are, because it isn't a Republican-Democrat issue. There are probably more Republicans that dislike it than Democrats. But I've talked to a lot of Democrats who have a lot of liberal Democrats who have real concerns, especially about the unelected ability to tax people. So I think the votes are there to make significant change, maybe not eliminate, but to make significant change. I'm not sure the governor would agree with that. And again, that's not necessarily a DFL thing, because whatever party the governor's from, they have been happy to appoint their own people to the Met Council.
That's
you
true.
Get to start from scratch. And I remember when Tim Pawlenty, a Republican, was governor and I was in the legislature, I thought the Met Council was horrible. And now I know that they really weren't so bad compared to what we have now. But, so I'm not sure the governor's going to agree to any massive reform, but they might be able to find some compromise where you can at least make some changes at this point and then see what, the next election brings, to see if there's an interest in the governor's office of getting rid of it and starting over, or cutting back on its legislative powers.
Is this a statewide issue, do you think?
You mean a political issue that everyone's interested in?
Well, I mean, a political issue that perhaps someone could ride into the governor's office. Let's just put it that way.
I'm not sure. It's probably not. If you get to Greater Minnesota, most people aren't going to care at all, because it really does. You could argue it affects them because the state overall gives a lot of money to the Met Council. But I don't see a lot of people out there thinking that it affects them all that much. And I will tell you what, I think most people in the metro don't have the slightest clue about, you'd have to spend a lot of money explaining it to them. It's not one of those issues that is simple. So I'm not sure. I think it's probably a good issue for those who are politically active because they follow this sort of thing. But for the general population, I don't know.
So you feel the compromise is basically to repeal and replace, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and there are some who say we don't need a regional authority anymore. And that's a debate to have. I think a regional authority for purposes of a transportation system and still for sewer and water does still make sense, but it should be limited to that. And that's what the replacement would be. And it should be legislatively limited to that. And it should be, if it has taxing authority, it needs to be people who are elected by someone.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the future, and I mean the far-out future. Do you often think about what an urban area looks like when with driverless cars and with a much less concentrated workforce where companies don't need 14 floors of buildings downtown? Is there an alternative vision of the future that doesn't look like what they are perceiving, and that we're all going to look like Norway, also, or whatever it is?
Yeah, there is. And actually, it's interesting because I kind of forced my way onto our own comprehensive plan committee in Hennepin County because I'm quite afraid of what our comprehensive plan is going to look like. And we brought in a couple of professors from the U of M who are futurists on transportation issues. And you know what? They may very well be far left-wing liberals. We never got to that. We talked about transportation. And when they talked about what they truly believe America is going to look like in 20 years from a transportation standpoint, fixed rail trains make absolutely no sense whatsoever. I mean, they don't believe that anybody's even going to own a car anymore because you'll press a button on your phone and a self-driving car down the street will be at your door in 30 seconds to bring you wherever you need to go and then drop you off and go pick up someone else. So it's, we are relying upon, when you're talking about light rail at least, we're relying upon a form of transportation from another century.
Right. We're relying on a vision.
Forward.
We're relying on a vision of early 20th century America, which is romantic, no question about it, but I'm not sure it's practical in some ways. And I'm not saying it isn't either, by the way.
No, I'm saying it isn't.
Well, yeah, and I think that's what drives them. This, especially with the trains. And my understanding is they've got, like, we're talking about a lot of new. It's not just going to be 3 or 4 lines of trains. It's going to be. They're very invested in this train idea. I know the chair of the Met Council is just very invested in this idea of trains. This vision of northern European vision of a city. How do you counter that, especially when you might be the only guy in the Hennepin Council, the county council, saying we shouldn't be doing this?
Well, I am. There are frequent 6-1 votes on any light issue. And it's funny because when I was first elected, somebody on staff was very honest with me and apparently didn't know what my views were on trains because they said to me, okay, we learned this lesson in, I don't remember which state, but they had just finally gotten the Hiawatha line done after, it took 30 years to finally get that through the political process because there was so much pushback. And they said, what we've learned in other states is once you get that first line done, you get as many new lines in queue, started funding as possible because the opposition is going to be, off kilter for a decade or so before they start fighting back. And that's what we're doing.
Well, thank you for joining me. Great stuff. And I hope we get some reaction, and I look forward to future videos.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks a ton. Jeff Johnson, Hennepin County Commissioner, District 7. I love that District 7 moniker. So thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this week. This is the Bob Davis Podcast Radio Show. Well, that's going to do it for this week's Bob Davis Podcast Radio Show. This is the radio show number 61 and the podcast number 590. By the way, if you're in radio and you're listening to this, I've been contacting radio stations to get this show on their, air. And if you want the show, just send me an email and I can help you get the show. It's great because this show is really designed to move around paid programming for talk radio on the weekends, and no station is too small or too big for the Bob Davis Podcast Radio Show. All right, thanks for listening. Have a great weekend. Boop.